Welcome back to the show, everyone. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. The live stream marathon continues in the month of February. As you can see, I am joined by Alexander Mercouris of the Duran. Alexander, it is really good to be back with you. Thanks for joining.
I'm delighted to be back as well. And I think it's the first one we've done this year. So it's a
Yeah,
great pleasure to be here this year,
yeah.
2026.
Yes, for sure. It's been a busy 2026, Alexander. Everybody, hit the like button as you come on. That helps boost the show so more people can hear this discussion. And we'll just get started. So, Alexander, I wanted to ask you about the Russia-Iran relationship in particular, as the U.S. has gotten to the brink of strikes on Iran, not one but two times in the last month or so. And I wanted to get your reaction. I know that you are a astute reader of UK-based media, and this was revealed by the Telegraph, or supposedly revealed, that Russia has been sending direct cash shipments to Iran. They say upwards of 2.5 billion US dollars. They cite the shipments as being from 2018, Donald Trump's administration, the first one, but they said that these shipments are likely continuing. But what I found more interesting as well was, and there's been a lot of debate about the Russia-Iran relationship and its role in stymieing or preventing or reacting and confronting aggression toward Iran. But the Jerusalem Post published this. They said Iran is stepping up its missile upgrades with Russian help amid these strike fears, especially around instituting the most modern radar systems and other kinds of technologies in these missiles to make them more effective. Alexander, what have you made of this push that the United States has made toward war with Iran? And how do you think Russia's assistance to Iran is making a difference? I didn't even mention the diplomatic part of this, and I think we can get to all of this as we enter the discussion. So, to you.
We absolutely will. The first thing to say is that if we can just quickly talk about why the United States is preparing to go to war with Iran, it has been something we've been long predicting. We've discussed it, Danny and I, in previous programs we've done. This is unfinished business from the June war. The United States clearly is seeking, in my opinion, regime change in Iran. They barely disguise it anymore. Now, Iran is a member of the BRICS. Russia is a member of the BRICS. These two countries have a very, very long history, and that it has not been a friendly one. I think this is the thing that is the first thing to understand. There have been 3 wars between Russia and Iran up to the middle of the 19th century. And Russia in the 18th and 19th centuries expanded significantly at Iran's expense. Before the First World War, the Russians almost succeeded in making Iran a kind of virtual colony of Russia. Because again, it's a history that isn't very well known, but the Russians even divided Iran into spheres of influence between themselves and the British. This is just before the First World War. And in the lead up to the First World War, they were almost pushing the British out of Iran. This is, the last Floriat of the Tsarist Empire. Then afterwards, during the Soviet Revolution, there was again critical conflicts between Iran and the Soviet Union. In 1941, at the start of the Second World War, the Soviet Union invaded Iran, occupied Tehran. They said that Iran was potentially an ally of Nazi Germany. And at the time when the famous Tehran conference happened between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin in Tehran in 1943, Tehran was occupied by the Soviet army, by the Red Army, a fact which many, many people don't know. And then after the Second World War, the Soviet Union for a time tried to continue to occupy northern Iran, territory called Azerbaijan. They eventually left, but not after significant American pressure. And during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, the Soviet Union mostly backed Saddam Hussein and was his major arms supplier. So this is not a relationship that has been a very friendly one. The Iranians have a long history of being very suspicious of the Russians. And when you go through the history, it's not difficult to understand why. Nonetheless, there is a convergence of interest. They're starting to become closer to each other. Russia has put itself forward to Iran as a potential arms supplier. The Iranians have been very nervous of getting too close to the Russians, partly for all of these reasons, partly because they don't fully trust the Russians. They recently started to buy weapons from Russia. There is great uncertainty as to exactly which weapons, but recently Mi-28 helicopter gunships have been confirmed as have been being bought by Iran. And then there is all this enormous speculation about the other contacts and relationships that Iran and Russia has been having. Now, about the question of the banknotes, this is very interesting and very important, potentially, given the crisis that happened in Iran early this year. In the first weeks of this year, there was, as we all know, a major financial crisis in Iran. The Iranian currency, the rial, almost collapsed. The US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, admitted that this was part of a US operation to create a crisis in Iran by manufacturing a dollar shortage there. I was puzzled at the time why Iran didn't turn to its BRICS partners, to China and Russia, for help in the middle of this crisis. Perhaps this article in the Daily Telegraph suggests that since then, that is exactly what Iran has been doing. And it could be that the Russians, who have significant foreign currency reserves, and perhaps the Chinese, through the Russians, are now finally taking steps to support the rial. And I wonder whether that is what that Daily Telegraph story was all about. Now, we haven't explored China. China is a major part of this story. China and Iran also have close relations. And I've heard reports that Ali Larijani, who is Iran's chief security official, he is the national security advisor of Ayatollah Khamenei. He did a recent trip to Moscow. He did a trip to Moscow last week. He met Putin there. But I now understand that he also met senior Chinese officials whilst he was in Moscow as well. China, of course, has the biggest foreign currency reserves in the world, $3.5 trillion worth. So for them, supporting the Iranian currency would be a very straightforward matter. So various pieces starting to move, but I've just provided some of the background.
Yeah, and maybe I don't know if you can comment because I know Russia and Iran's missile capabilities are often spoken about with great fear and consternation in the collective West. But there's a lot of confusion in that Telegraph article itself. They speculated that these banknotes could be in part for payment of certain kinds of Iranian weapons to Russia. But in the Jerusalem Post that I put up, they said that no, Russia is providing higher technology now to Iran, so their missiles become more effective. For example, more advanced radar systems. What is the reality here? And what's the significance of this? Because on the military front, Iran is acting much different than it did in June of 2025, right before the strikes. The way that they are posturing and the way that they are speaking about how they're going to defend themselves appears to be much stronger and much more confident than at that time. If you agree with that, I don't know if you agree with that, but I wanted to pose this question to you.
Well, I think we'll explore the Iranian thinking in a moment. But I mean, the Iranians are certainly approaching this crisis very differently from the one that from the way they approached the June crisis. Now, this is the great problem because there's lots of rumors, lots of stories about what the Russians and by the way, the Chinese and the Iranians are doing with each other, but not very much information. So to give an example, back in the summer of 2024, there are a lot of rumors that the Russians have supplied S-400 surface-to-air missiles to Iran. It turned out that wasn't true. So already you see there are stories spread, there are allegations made, and we don't always know the facts. If the Russians are providing direct funding to Iran, if they're sending money to Iran, my guess is that it's much more likely to be money sent in order to support the Iranian currency and the Iranian domestic economy. Because if you are talking about weapon supplies in the modern world, being realistic, $2.5 billion since 2018 doesn't provide you with very much. If you are talking about supporting a currency like the real, it makes a huge difference. So if there really is a financial flow through Moscow to Tehran, I suspect it has more of an economic significance. And of course, the British would probably want to downplay that because they don't want to draw attention to the fact that Iran is now a BRICS state and that there are possibilities through the BRICS of supporting Iran's economy and of strengthening it via BRICS in a way that will defeat the sanctions. And at the same time, they want to emphasize the fact that Iranian weapons are coming from Russia. But just very quickly say, the Russians have bought weapons from Iran. They bought Shahed drones, for example, and they developed those drones. But again, I doubt that this explains any big money flows of the kind that the Daily Telegraph is talking about. Now, about weapons, there is a fundamental difference between Russian missile technology and Iranian missile technology. And, this isn't an easy thing to for some people to acknowledge, but obviously Russia, as a former superpower and a country with an enormous scientific base and a huge chemical industry and other sort of industry, is going to function at a different technological level from Iran. And they can do targeting, they have satellites, they have all kinds of information, which the Iranians don't have to anything like the same degree. Iran, however, does have a significant industrial base, and it does have a significant technology base. And it is likely that there has been technology exchange between Russia and Iran, and it is likely that the Iranians have developed and improved their missiles as a result of that technology exchange. Though Iran probably does have a capability to update and develop its own missiles to a great degree using its own resources. So Iran does have advanced ballistic missiles. They can penetrate Israeli defenses and American defenses. They demonstrated that they have that capability over the course of the June war. What we don't know is whether these missiles would be able, for example, to attack carriers. The Iranians hint they would be. That would be a massive game changer if it could happen. And we don't know the quantities of these missiles and of Iran's production capabilities. So we can debate these things. We can talk about technology transfers between Russia and Iran and between China and Iran, but we simply don't know the exact details.
Yeah, and I find what's interesting is in these last several days and weeks, we've seen almost an escalation in how the Israeli media, how the U.S. media is reacting to the delay in a strike by Trump, and now inserting Russia into the conversation. And there's always all kinds of debates about how Russia and China's support makes a difference for Iran. But now it seems like there's just a lot of concern about the Iranian missile capabilities, that it appears there's a motivation to connect Russia to it in some way.
Yes, well, again, we need to be very careful because, of course, one of the things that the Israelis are pushing very hard for is that they want Iran to agree to major cutbacks in their missile capabilities. Now, they might be doing that because they are worried and afraid of these missiles, and probably to some extent they are. We saw, as I said, during the June war, that Iranian missiles can reach Israel and can penetrate defenses and can do real damage. But there might also be a political motive as well, in that the Israelis are playing up this issue of ballistic missiles because for the same reason that they've been playing up the nuclear threat from Iran, because they want to make Iran look like a threat, and they want to provide justification for an attack upon it. So we need to be careful. And again, these connections with Russia, which probably do exist at some level, but they may also be overstated precisely again in order to conjure up this image of an Iran that is this enormous, terrifying danger to the Middle East, to the United States, to the Western world, which is in league with America's and the West's enemies, with the Russians and perhaps the Chinese too. And therefore, we play up all of these connections and make them seem even more serious and more dangerous than they actually are, so that when we do eventually attack Iran, we have already explanation there. I mean, there is perhaps something of the Iraq WMD thing about all of this.
Yeah, and maybe now we can, if you wanted to comment on, because I think this has been one of the more significant developments over the course of this period of now we're going to be soon start talking about months of escalation against Iran at the kinetic level. We've seen Russia step in diplomatically. We saw the top security council leader, Ali Larijani. He visited Russia at the height and talked to Putin himself at the height of these threats of a U.S. strike. And of course, Russia throughout this process has been talking to all parties. And as these now negotiations, as they're being called, with the United States have come underway, Iran is talking about their main partners for consulting on these issues are Russia and China. So what's the significance of Russia's role in this arena, and how does that play a role in the kind of ongoing rolling saga that is this coming war?
Well, let's go back to your earlier question, which is the Iranian strategy and how it differs from the one in June, because this actually segues very immediately into this new question. Well, what the Iranians have said is that since the spring of 2024, they have faced a number of attacks, first by Israel, then by the United States. And they have tried to show to the Israelis and to the United States that Iran does have a deterrent capability, that if Israel and the United States can strike Iran, Iran itself can strike back, but that they have up to now held back from an all-out regional long war. Now, what the Iranians are saying, and top Iranian officials are saying, is that this has failed, that all of the attempts to try to prove to Israel and the United States that Iran has this power of deterrence have been unsuccessful. So that this time, unlike in June, where the war only lasted 12 days and the Iranians accepted a ceasefire proposal, which, by the way, came originally from Israel and the United States, this time, if they are attacked, they will go all out. They will attack American bases across the Middle East. They will go after American carriers. They will act, if they must, to close the Straits of Hormuz, and they will plan a long war. Now, their calculation is that the United States and Israel can wage a short war but they don't have the capabilities to continue a long one. And probably about that, they're right. And they probably also calculate that the Americans, that Donald Trump himself does not want a long war. Now, if Iran is going to be in a long drawn out war with the United States and Israel, a war that's going to last months, if you follow some of the rhetoric from Iran, perhaps even years, then obviously they're going to need support. They're going to need backers. And the only people, the only countries that would be in a position to provide Iran with that kind of long-term support, financial, economic, material, perhaps even military, are of course Russia and China. So this is the strategy that the Iranians are trying to form: a long war in which they're backed by their own major great power backers, as a way ultimately of grinding down the Americans and the Israelis and forcing them to a much more comprehensive settlement and peace agreement than the one that has been agreed up to now.
Yeah, a great point, Alexander. And I don't know if you saw the reports on. They were going all over social media on X. Of course, Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister of Iran, made a hint that there were security concerns about the IAEA inspecting Fordow and other nuclear sites because of unexploded ordinances, and that got a lot of speculation as to whether Iran now had access to the bunker busters that might not have caused the damage that they said they were going to cause. Tomahawk missiles, which were also fired at these nuclear sites. And some speculate about possible reverse engineering and Russia-Iran cooperation on that. What do you make of these reports and the impact? Because it's assumed that the more kinetic a conflict between Iran and the United States becomes, the more something like this is not only possible, but also places the U.S. at further risk, let alone all the other ones that we could list off in a war against Iran.
Well, of course, the first thing to say is we don't really know how much damage these American strikes on Fordow and Natanz and Isfahan last June really did. The Iranians have played all kinds of complex word games around this. I mean, sometimes they've hinted that the damage wasn't so great. Other times they've said, well, actually, probably was. They've been deliberately ambiguous about this, and they've been also deliberately ambiguous about the state of their nuclear program. And they've also played a very complex game with the IAEA itself. They were fully cooperating with the IAEA up to the June war, and I think this is an important thing to understand. Iran agreed as part of the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which it agreed with the Obama administration and the Europeans back in 2015 to put its nuclear sites under inspection, and it is widely accepted that it complied with that promise. So the IAEA inspectors were going into all of these sites and were monitoring them. The Iranians, after the June war, then said that this had been a terrible mistake on their part to cooperate with the IAEA inspectors to the extent that they had done, that the IAEA inspectors were actually cooperating with the Americans and the Israelis, that they provided the Americans and the Israelis with targeting data about these facilities, enabling the Americans and the Israelis to perfect the attacks on these centers, that they also identified all of the relevant scientists, which also set up these scientists for potential assassination. And then for a long time, Iran said after the June war that it was not prepared to cooperate any further with the IAEA. Then a short time ago, they said that they would cooperate after all, and this is part of this crisis. And of course, the IA inspectors can come and they can look around. But now they're saying, well, maybe actually you can't look at everything, because who knows, there might be unexploded ordnance there. There might be unexploded bombs left over from the war in June. We can't tell you for sure, and you might not be safe. So it seems to me that this is part of the game, the war of nerves that the Iranians and the Americans are playing with each other. Each side is playing these psychological games. There may indeed be all kinds of possibilities. I am sure, by the way, that the Chinese and the Russians have been all over the Fordow facility. They've been looking to find out as much information as they can about the American bunker buster bombs and all of that. And no doubt all that information has been relayed to Moscow, and China and their scientists are working on all of this. But I think the other point you made, what you were touching on, is a serious one, which is that putting all these speculations about what is actually in these facilities aside, if we do find ourselves in a long war which might be creating major problems for the United States and for Israel, the potential for greater escalation is very much there. The Americans and the Israelis might feel that they cannot simply agree to whatever demands Iran is making. It would be humiliating to them, and it would destroy their position in the Middle East. So that might cause them to escalate in incredibly dangerous ways. And of course, on the other side, if the Iranians really feel that their back is to the wall, well, they might also escalate in ways which we cannot imagine. I don't believe that Iran has a nuclear weapons capability, either present, definitely not present, or proximate. I think if Iran set itself the task of developing a nuclear weapon, it would probably still take years before it appeared, for straightforward technological engineering reasons. The United States and Israel are both nuclear powers.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big fear coming from a war like this, especially one where Iran is demonstrating. I believe them. I believe them. They're demonstrating that, or they're trying to demonstrate through words and through their preparations, that it would not be an easy. Not only would it not be an easy war, but it would be one where the U.S. and Israel might incur damage that they just cannot tolerate or accept. And that could lead to that very scenario that I think a lot of people have on their minds, a nuclear one. But now I wanted to ask you about Russia's perspective on all of this. As these escalations have been happening, Russia did say that they would not stand idly by, and they're not standing idly by, in this U.S.-Iran war escalation ladder that's being climbed. What does this mean to you, Alexander, just from the Russian perspective, given everything we talked about, how Russia is involved already in cooperation with Iran, but also just how Russia approaches these kinds of matters, especially given that this war could have, unfortunately, regional implications that do spread to Russia?
Right. For the Russians, this is a short-term nightmare and a long-term opportunity, depending on how things play out. Now, in the short term, they absolutely do not want an American attack on Iran. I think for them, this is massively destabilizing and extremely dangerous. They probably do know a lot about the internal situation in Iran, but there must always be worries in Moscow that the government in Iran might not be stable. And they obviously do not want the government to fall. It would be bad enough if the government fell and was replaced by a pro-American government. If the government fell and there was an even deeper crisis and Iran fractured and there was conflicts within Iran, then that would be a huge issue for Russia, because obviously Iran is not that far from Russia. It is close to former Soviet Central Asia. One thing that horrifies the Russians is the possibility of long-term instability in regions close to their borders. So the Russians are going to do everything they possibly can to support diplomatic efforts to avoid the war. And they've apparently made all kinds of proposals. They've suggested that Rosatom, the Russian nuclear power monopoly, come in and inspect the Iranian facilities and take over enrichment in Iran. There's been proposals which are not just coming from the Russians for some kind of consortium to take over the enrichment process in Iran to be set up. So they are doing what they can to avoid a conflict. And they've told us that in December, they brokered an agreement between Israel and Iran, whereby Israel agreed that it would not attack Iran, and Iran agreed that it would not attack Israel, provided the other side did not attack first. So they're trying, I think, sincerely and generally to avoid a war. If a war comes, the calculus starts to change. And here we come back to the question of Iranian resilience. Because if Iran is able to hold together and absorb the blow, then, as we've just discussed, Iran becomes more dependent on its friends, on Russia and China, and that gives Russia and China potential leverage over Iran, but it also gives Russia and China potential leverage over the United States. And there is a recent example of how that played out, and it's one which I'm sure, Danny, you're very familiar with, which is, of course, Vietnam, the Vietnam conflict, which is exactly what happened there. Both the Chinese and the Russians backed Vietnam, North Vietnam, against the United States. They did gain a lot of leverage over North Vietnam, but they used that leverage, the leverage also that they had over the United States as well, each of them, to get the United States to make substantive concessions to them. So this was the golden era of détente between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it was the period in which the United States opened up to China, and when Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing.
Yeah, that's a good point, and in this era too, when we think about Iran, I mean, the technological advances that Iran has made on the military front, in particular, versus the Vietnam situation, it does open up many more elements to that kind of. I don't know if it's possible. The U.S. is in a much different position, as you know, Alexander. The Trump administration, forget Trump, like every administration since the Vietnam era, especially in the last 2 decades or so, hard to imagine scrambling to try to get concessions to Russia and or China at this point. But nonetheless, I think it's interesting to note how Russia would approach Iran in this way, given given that this is a real disaster in the making, and it's not just Iran centered. And I think that's a big point I wanted to make in this conversation today, that Russia and of course China in large part, they are heavily involved in the calculations made around Iran. Any comments you want to make on this? Because Iran oftentimes is looked at as a silo. Like, look at that, the U.S. and neocons on the middle. Look at that big bad country that is funding proxies, has all these missiles, but Russia and China are right there in the calculations.
Well, of course they are, and absolutely they are. And I think the important thing to say about Iran is, yes, it does have allies, regional allies. It is a major power in the Middle East with a very long history in the Middle East. It has co-religionists, the Shia communities in Iraq, Lebanon, and, well, I don't know whether the Houthis are exactly Shias, but anyway, they are people who doctrinally, shall we say, have closer connections to Iran. It is not surprising that Iran has regional friends. And yes, all of these countries, all of these communities have militias, but we are talking about a fractured region where there are lots of militias. You would expect to see militias in all of these places. And if they're Shia militias, then inevitably they're going to look to Iran. Iran itself, until 2024, never launched a single missile against Israel and avoided, to the extent that it could, all open conflict with the United States. I do not myself see Iran as an aggressive power. Yes, they have been involved in all sorts of covert activities. You could call them, if you wished, terrorist activities. But every Middle East state, including Israel, has been involved in similar sorts of activities. I don't see again that Iran has done this to a greater extent than any other state in the Middle East has done. I do not see this as an aggressive country. I see this enormous build-up and these threats against Iran as instead aggressive. And I do not see Iran as posing a threat to the stability of the Middle East. The threat to the stability of the Middle East and the pressure of war comes from Israel and from the United States. Now, as for the Russians and the Chinese, as I said, they do not want war. This is, as I say, potentially a disaster for them. But of course, they will be calculating. There are people who do calculations. They showed in the 1960s how it can work for them. And they have a habit, they have a way in these sort of conflicts of, in the end, coming out of on top, because they calculate in some ways more thoroughly and more carefully than the Americans do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Iran has said quite clearly what's so interesting about that, the claims that are made about Iran sponsoring terrorism and funding all. Iran never even hides that they support, Palestinian armed resistance or Ansarallah, or they say that they're not their proxies, but they don't hide that they provide support to these groups, Hezbollah, etc. I mean, it's not a secret, and so. It's so interesting because I guess one person's terrorist is another one's freedom fighter. And then you have, Israel and Saudi Arabia, Qatar providing direct aid to, jihadists and takfiris and all those kind of elements. It's certainly an interesting layout around this debate. But I wanted to ask you now about, how much of a disaster is this for Donald Trump? Because the Trump administration has really come to this point where Iran is saying there's going to be a regional war if the U.S. attacks, and the Trump administration has been building up militarily as much as it can, air defenses to its so-called allies, of course, the so-called Armada. But 2 delayed strikes, Alexander. That says something in my assessment. What does it say to you? Because right now we are in this, I guess, holding pattern where the risk is very high, but obviously there are considerations being made. Netanyahu is going to run to Washington for the 3,000th time. What do you make of the disaster that this could be for Trump, or is this all part of the big plan that some people have said is a part of Trump's calculations?
Well, to say straight away, I don't think Trump is capable of formulating any great plans, and I think that one should put ideas that there is some great plan, some grand strategy behind all of this to one side. I think that Donald Trump has a basic lack of understanding of the Middle East and of Iran itself. I think he assumes, and has been told by far too many people, that the government in Iran is very precarious, that Iran is a house of cards, that if he blows hard enough, that house of cards will fall, and that he can simply then move in, take over its oil and its natural resources, install whoever he thinks should be the leader of Iran, make Iran an American ally or satellite, and all would be very, very easy. And I think if we go back to the June war, I think that the Israelis told him that we will be able to carry out this decapitation strike on the first day, we're going to be able to kill all the major Iranian leaders, the Ayatollah, the president, Pezeshkian, all of the officials. All you need to do is to sit back, and it will be easy, and it will be done smoothly, and you don't need to worry. So I think this is what Trump has been told, and I think for a long time he's believed it. I don't think Trump likes Iran at all. I think he's accepted all the usual things, the usual stories about Iran that circulate every day in the media in the West. And I think he thinks it'd be a great victory and a wonderful win for him if he is able to be the man who has overthrown the government of Iran and has achieved the outcome that I said. Now, the trouble is, I think he's starting to understand that this whole situation might be a lot more complicated than he realized, that Iran is a more complex society than he reckoned, that the country is very big, that the population is very large, that the government actually does have a critical mass of support. There are many unhappy people in Iran. The economic situation is not good. But nonetheless, there is still a significant part of Iranian society that supports the current government, if only for religious reasons, and that Iran's military is not to be disregarded, and that the other great powers, China and Russia, because of Iran's size and its regional importance, can't simply ignore what the United States is doing there. And this explains all of the hesitations and the uncertainties, because Trump doesn't want a long war, but having reached this point, he can't easily back off. If he does, he will lose face. Some of his donors will be unhappy. His friend Netanyahu will be unhappy. All of the various people who've been worked up in the United States to seek this war will be unhappy, and he will be criticized. The reality is that if there is a war, and unless it succeeds in the way that he wants, if it is a long war, it is going to destroy him, just as Vietnam destroyed Lyndon Johnson. Just as Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program basically never succeeded because of Vietnam. So whatever complicated, incoherent economic plans Donald Trump has with tariffs, whatever it is, all of that will fail if he finds himself in a long war in the Middle East with Iran.
Yeah, it would be far worse than what, after George W. Bush, the junior, after George Bush Jr. was in, the Republican Party was never really the same after that. And hence Donald Trump is now in the archetype leader now of the Republican Party. That wouldn't have been made possible if it weren't for the wars that Trump used to say shouldn't be spending trillions of dollars on, shouldn't be doing, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. But I wanted to definitely get to Ukraine soon. I just wanted to ask your final comment on this, if I can actually remember what I wanted to ask, with regard to the crisis that this could cause for Trump. He seems to believe, or at least I don't believe it's just him. I believe that his team, some parts of his cabinet, whoever it is, they have this kind of obsession with this idea of like quick strike. Like, we're going to quickly strike, we're going to hit, and then everything is going to go our way. That seems to be the model that the Trump administration wants to impose on wherever it is seeking to exert its influence and dominance. Are we in that era anymore, though? Or has that era really ever existed, Alexander? Because I just don't see, when we look at the chessboard or the geopolitical landscape, that is something really possible. And if it's not possible, then why consider it?
Well, this is how the United States actually tends to wage wars, or at least has waged wars since Vietnam. Vietnam was America's last long war, and it ended disastrously. The United States has not wanted to stop doing war since then. It's done many wars, in fact, but it always tries to fight them quickly, to have them over with quickly, to achieve its political objectives as fast as possible. because it knows that it really isn't in a position as a society, as an economy even, to sustain a long war. The problem is, even if you appear to win in a short war, what the Americans repeatedly discover is that whatever they achieve is ephemeral. The other side isn't really defeated, and it comes back. I mean, we saw that in Afghanistan, we've seen that in Iraq, we've seen that probably in other places. I would argue the Balkans, the Yugoslav wars, which have never really resolved themselves, are another example of this. So this is probably not the way to conduct war and to conduct foreign policy. It always, and in the case of an adversary like Iran and before that Vietnam, thinking you can achieve a quick knockout blow places too much reliance upon what you believe your enemy's weaknesses to be. If those weaknesses are not there, if your enemy is not prepared to fight your war in a way that you want it to, then of course you're going to be in serious trouble.
Yeah, that poses the question, trying to figure out the right way of doing war poses the question, why are you going on an offensive war in the first place? And can those objectives even be met without the absolute carnage that these wars and the crises and chaos that they produce? The answer is always no, but nonetheless, here we are. These neocons and their power brokers, the money, they can't stop. So this is we're gonna have to keep on observing this, Alexander. They don't even have a force the U.S. likes to install, even if it's chaos, even if it's the Taliban, like 2000 during Afghanistan. They don't care who it is, but they usually have a force or forces that they say, okay, you can take over and do our bidding. Maybe, if you're willing to. They don't even have that in Iran at all. I mean, there's no observable force. And of course, we saw what happened during those so-called protests / riots. Those forces were not politically capable, no matter how well armed they were, to cause so much damage, to do anything other than what happened, which is they got silenced.
Well, you're right in all you said. I mean, it's often seen to me that the Romans. It was one said of them that they create a desert and they call it peace. That was what criticism of Roman imperialism that was made at the time of the Roman Empire by Roman historian Tacitus. It seems to me that the Americans create chaos and call it freedom, because that is how these interventions generally turn out. I mean, we don't actually have stable governments and structures, but they're always promoted. I mean, we see this with the Iranian protests. They're always promoted as coming to the rescue of people who need and desire and hanker for freedom. But the result is mostly chaos.
Yeah. Well, how about we talk about the conflict in Ukraine? According to reports, Alexander, Donald Trump, according to reports mainly from Zelensky himself, Donald Trump has set a summer deadline, a June deadline in particular, for this conflict to be resolved in whatever way Donald Trump fantasizes it'll be resolved in. I'm curious on what your assessment is of now the overall situation. There were these trilateral talks. Not much was made of them. Now there's continuing strikes. Russia keeps pounding Ukraine's energy sector, and there is now reports of, and I'm curious on your thoughts about this, Starlink shutting down, so making it much more difficult for Russia to navigate the battlefield. I'm curious on what your overall assessment is of what's going on in this conflict, given the latest developments.
Well, Donald Trump has set many deadlines at various times over the course of this conflict. I mean, I remember one of them, for example, was that, right at the beginning, he wanted a ceasefire. This is in 2025. He became president in January. He wanted a ceasefire by Easter 2025. And he sent all of his people to talk to the Russians. He talked to the Ukrainians. He telephoned Putin. He gave everybody this idea that there would be a ceasefire by Easter. Of course, it never happened. And then in the summer, he gave the Russians a warning that he wanted a ceasefire by the middle of August. And of course, the Russians paid no attention, and there was no ceasefire by the middle of August. And in fact, what we got instead was the Anchorage summit meeting. So Trump has a habit of imposing ceasefires. I don't think the Russians, and it is the Russians ultimately who are the deciders here. I mean, Zelensky would love a ceasefire or some end to the hostilities with the situation unresolved. I don't think the Russians are interested in Donald Trump's deadlines, and I don't think they're going to pay any attention to them. And they've been making a whole series of statements, or at least the Russian foreign minister Lavrov has been making statements, and they've been getting actually increasingly hard line. Lavrov gave an interview yesterday in which he said that the Russians and the Americans had come to all sorts of agreements in Anchorage during the meeting that took place between Trump and Putin, and that the Americans have failed to honor any of them. That, in fact, they've been unable to move forward, and they've become increasingly aggressive. And my sense is that so far from the Russians being in a mood to agree to deadlines, they're actually hardening their stance. And all of these missile and drone and bomb attacks that we've seen from the Russians over the last few weeks are, of course, completely consistent with that. And as for these Anchorage talks, as to these tripartite meetings that have been taking place in Abu Dhabi, it seems to me that on the Russian side, they're being conducted at a very low level by military and security officials. Eventually, if there's a sudden political breakthrough, that might lead to something. But as of now, there is of that no sign. I don't see any sign that the Russians are prepared to back off. And as for the Starlink story, this has been very, very widely promoted, especially from Ukraine. The Russian army does not depend on its communication on an American system operated by Elon Musk. I really don't know where this absurd idea has come from. They have piggybacked on Starlink. They sent some of their drones deep into Ukraine because they found it was a nice and convenient way to use Starlink. And some of their assault troops were perhaps using Starlink because they captured some Starlink terminals and it was convenient for them to communicate and send messages between each other using these terminals. But the Russian military as a whole has its own means of communication, which are completely independent of Starlink. This story, which, as I say, originally started with an article in the Kiev Post, is completely wrong.
Well, it's so interesting, Alexander, to believe this whole notion of Starlink and greatly, not just negatively impacting, but greatly negatively impacting Russia on the battlefield. As we just had Iran deal with a whole Starlink fiasco where the proxies who were committing all these horrific crimes were using Starlink to connect with their funders and donors and so-called supporters. And Iran was able to essentially smash that effort. They tracked them down. They had technology at their disposal to do this, to shut it down. And some speculated it was China or Russia who helped them do this. So it'd be so interesting for Russia to be very aware of the situation that was going on in Iran and depend on that same technology.
Well, I mean, the whole idea is absurd. And again, I find it strange that people give so much credence to these stories. You get lots of stories out of Ukraine. I mean, on both sides, by the way. I mean, both sides fantasize and embroider and exaggerate and make things out to be different from the way they sometimes are. So, you know, you need to keep a cool head and be a bit level-headed. I mean, the Russian military is not going to rely on an American technology and means of communication to wage a war in which it is fighting a proxy of the United States. I mean, that makes absolutely no sense. If Russia was a backward, primitive country without its own means of communication, well, maybe, but they're not that. They have their own methods of communicating with their soldiers and their forces, and that's what they do.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that interview from Sergei Lavrov for TV Bricks, actually, and
Yeah.
he said in that, and I think this shows the Russian mood in large part. He said that in many ways Trump has repeated Bidenism,
Yeah.
and he cited in particular sanctions, which, if we look at the Trump administration, of course, continuing sanctions, not relieving any sanctions on Russia, and actually escalating them in some respects. It would be quite ironic for Russia to be taking advantage of Elon Musk Starlink satellite apparatus, which ostensibly would be a violation of sanctions and would put. So the Ukraine story around this is very it's very curious and very
Yes.
surprising, but also reeks of desperation. I'm wondering if you could speak to this, because we don't get reports from the battlefield anymore, Alexander. We only get reports of Russian strikes on the energy sector now. But when I look through the mainstream media, I'm not seeing any. So what's going on? Is this really more of a sign of desperation than anything?
Well, it is a sign of desperation, and it's absolutely true. We don't get many reports of the battlefronts, at least not in the media in the West. And there are reasons for this. Firstly, it is winter. Winter does mean that it's more difficult for armies to advance. There's snow and slush and very cold temperatures, and that really does affect soldiers. Though one can overstate this, and if there's one army in the world that knows how to fight it in winter, it is the Russian army. But the major reason why we're not hearing information from the battlefronts to the extent that we did is because the news is bad. It continues to get bad. Now, in December, a whole succession of important towns, Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, Rodinska, Gulyapolye, they all fell one after the other. The Russians broke through, in other words, one of the major defense lines, some of the major defense lines that the Ukrainians had created in Donbass. And they've also made very big advances in Zaporozhye region. Now, what that has done is that this has brought the Russians closer to what is in Donbass, the last big defense line, which is the cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Now, when you reach a defense line, before you attack that defense line, you have to organize and slow down. And that is to some extent what has been happening. But when we talk about a slowdown, it's a slowdown which eventually would lead to another big attack. And in fact, it doesn't mean that fighting isn't going on and that places don't continue to fall and that the Russians don't capture positions. And in fact, they have been doing that. They've been capturing more and more places, maybe not famous or important places, not big ones. But if you think of this in some ways as a game of checkers, you could see how the Russians are filling up the squares, taking all the various positions around the main Ukrainian positions that they want to take. And when the thaw comes, after the thaw comes in early spring, the Russians will be on the move again, and we will start to see things start to move very rapidly once more, exactly as happened in 2024 and exactly as happened on a bigger scale in 2025. So that's the situation on the battlefronts. And of course, if you're talking about the cities, the Russian strikes there have been of an intensity that we've never seen in the war before. They have been deeply devastating. They're bringing the entire Ukrainian economy to the brink of complete collapse. And they've also been inflicting very severe suffering on the population of Ukraine. And Zelensky, who knows about at least some of the events on the battlefronts and also knows about the crisis in the cities and in the economy, he is getting desperate. And some of his rhetoric reflects this.
Hmm. Yeah, and one bit truth that I saw out of these reports, Alexander, is that Donald Trump wants this conflict to, at the very least, be frozen by the midterm elections. I 100% believe that. The problem is I see a big problem facing Donald Trump on all levels and all of the in the Trump administration at all theaters or fronts, if you will, is that Donald Trump's administration has this character to it where they want these quick strikes and they want to look really strong, and so they move really fast to try to get something done, and then they find out that there are major barriers, and then what the Trump administration often looks like is an aggressive version of like a child that is throwing a tantrum but isn't really doing much, right? They're not doing much, but they're just kind of throwing a tantrum. And that's kind of how I see it. It's almost like whistling past a graveyard, so to speak, because in my estimation, the Trump administration, like all administrations beforehand, are inheriting this declining empire, and it just so happens to be in a major crisis and a worse crisis. It seems like each and every administration that comes afterward. So, what do you make of Trump's approach here when it comes to the conflict? Many believed he was serious about getting some kind of agreement and getting this off of his track record, but it seems like things have become a lot more difficult in that regard.
Well, they have. I think this is another. This brings us back to Trump again. I think he did imagine that this would be a much easier conflict to end than it really turned out to be. I think, like a lot of people, he assumed that the Russians were suffering incredible losses, that their economy was under tremendous strain, that they would quickly agree to a ceasefire, that they would take what they had, and that they would give up on everything else. And I think he came in last year very firmly convinced of that. And I think it hasn't turned out that way. So since then, he's been thrashing around. On the one hand, he does want the conflict to end. He wants a success, as you absolutely rightly say, before the midterms, because he wants to go into the midterms saying, look, this great war in Ukraine, I ended it. There'll be no American tax dollars flowing to Ukraine anymore. I'm the president who is able to do these things. Biden started this war. I ended it. So he wants that. At the same time, what he's discovering is that he can't, and at least he can't on the sort of terms that he wants to end it on, because he doesn't want to make the fundamental concessions to the Russians, which might indeed persuade the Russians to stop. He won't agree, for example, publicly that Ukraine won't join NATO. What he is talking about instead is that Ukraine won't join NATO, but will get security guarantees from the United States that are equivalent to Ukraine joining NATO. The Russians, over the last few weeks, have said, you must be joking. This is absurd. I mean, they have actually formally rejected that proposal. The Russian foreign ministry has released statements saying this, which, by the way, have not been widely circulated in the West. So the Russians are not going to agree to a peace simply in order to help Donald Trump through the midterm elections. In fact, I get to say something, which is that The Russians know that Trump is in a hurry. Putin's spokesman, Peskov, actually said that. He said that the Americans are in a hurry because they've got the midterms. And of course, if somebody is in a hurry, the Russians will sense that that puts them in a weaker position, not a stronger one. And that could very well cause the Russians to dig in even more.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, do you find that the reaction from the Trump administration, Lavrov talking about the sanctions not being lifted, no relief, no real movement, even on the normalization front or restoring economic ties? But and now you have the whole New Start fiasco where the Trump administration has said no one should be surprised by this. Really, Donald Trump has torn up a few nuclear-related agreements in the past, but he said, nope, we're going to have to renegotiate a whole new deal that benefits the United States, which is akin to saying, no, this is over. Which, Alexander, where does this fit in the? Do frustrations around Ukraine have any part to play in this? Because we know that Trump has also a petty streak. I mean, he does not like to be he doesn't like anyone who doesn't just follow along with what he wants.
Well, that's entirely right. And I have to say this. This repeats the pattern of his first administration. People forget that the big bonfire of arms control treaties happened during Trump's first administration. He walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty. He walked out of the Open Skies Agreement. He walked out of other arms control treaties as well. And going back to our discussion about Iran, he walked out of the JCPOA. And he also further tightened sanctions on Russia during his first term. And he also started the process of supplying weapons to Ukraine, doing it publicly. Up to that time, the United States had been doing it covertly, but Trump made it public and he started to supply weapons to Ukraine on a much bigger scale. So we see the reversion this time. So again, Trump is walking away from a big arms control treaty, which is the START treaty. He's walking away from any ideas of sanctions relief. He is, in fact, escalating sanctions. In fact, he's going far beyond sanctions. I mean, Lavrov was complaining about seizure of ships on the high seas and things of that kind. So, and of course, he's trying to put more economic pressure on Russia through things like pressure on India to stop buying Russian oil and things of that kind. So this is the way Trump responds. When he feels he's not getting what he wants, he tends to lash out. At the same time, he's also the sort of person who, if he's pushed into a corner, is more likely, I think, to back down if he can, because it's his way of getting the off-ramp that he wants. So the Russians know all of this. They calculate all of this very carefully, and they'll be judging their positions very, very carefully. But in the meantime, they're going to continue the war, and they're not going to, as I said, shape their actions on the battlefields to suit Trump's timetable.
Yeah. Alexander, do you know if you brought up that report, and maybe we can, I think we can close on this area of the geopolitics and the relationship to the economy is, do you know if that actually happened? Because Russia, I mean, I haven't heard much on the Indian side about whether this trade agreement with the United States actually includes stopping purchase of oil from Russia, which seems like a tall task and a very bad decision. But Russia has said they've heard nothing from the Indian side about this. What's the reality here? Is this Donald Trump spin? Is this the truth? Have you seen or heard anything to validate this?
Well, the only reports that have been in by Reuters, which is the British news agency, which says that India does seem to be slowing down purchases of Russian oil and that they haven't purchased any for April. But of course, that isn't so unusual. I mean, you purchase oil when you need. There's fluctuations in markets. It might not mean very much. Certainly, India has made no such announcement. Modi has made no such announcement. And in every other respect, Indian Russian cooperation seems to be accelerating. So there's apparently more talks between India and Russia to build fifth generation Russian fighter jets in India. The Russians and the Indians seem to be moving forward on plans to work together in civil aviation. The Russians are also major exporters of fertilizer to India, and there seem to be ambitious plans between India and Russia to accelerate their economic relations. So the Russians say they haven't heard anything. The Indians haven't said anything. Apart from this report in Reuters, there doesn't seem to be much in the way of confirmation of this. And I'm afraid Trump himself has a record here, because last year he invented an entire conversation with Modi. He said he'd spoken over the phone to Modi and that Modi had promised him that by the end of 2025, India would end all purchases of Russian oil. And then the Indian Foreign Ministry said that they had no knowledge of such a call. And India continued to buy Russian oil after the end of 2025. So I suspect he's making it up. What he wants is that he wants to end the, he wants to develop a free trade relationship, or a trade relationship with India. I think he, like many others, he sees India as a very, very big market, potential market. He's probably feels rivalrous because the European Union has just concluded a big free trade agreement with India. And by the way, the European Union is a bigger trade partner with India than the United States itself is.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's also all of these relations with Russia. So he comes along, which are developing and which have, by the way, big potential between India and Russia. So he comes along. He says, "Look, I want to end tariffs. I want to get trade agreements going. So I'm going to issue this executive order. I'm going to pretend that the Indians have done all of these, made all these promises about Russian oil. I'm going to pretend that they've made further promises to allow American agricultural exports to India. I can then lower the tariffs and get this trade agreement going. And then, of course, when it turns out that it's all otherwise in a few months' time, well, by then, hopefully, nobody will be interested anymore." It's very typical of Donald Trump.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And also what's typical, which goes along with this, Alexander, is the narrative of the Trump administration has been very inconsistent when it comes to what I believe is actually happening, which is regardless of how you spin it, whether it's okay, America is going to be great and strong again, and we're going to move here and there and move our assets militarily and our focus foreign policy wise elsewhere. The focus, it seems like still it's about containing Russia and China as growing powers. And the messaging is very inconsistent in the sense that Donald Trump, unlike past presidents outside of himself, he doesn't consistently paint Russia and China as enemies. Yet the instability, it seems like, and the consistency of the policy of containment and trying to be stronger than and therefore weaken Russia and China is having some consequences, and it causes its instability, which then I think does this, Alexander. I want your comment on this development. You know, China is urging their banks now to curb exposure to U.S. Treasuries, a longstanding pattern where China has been shedding these Treasury bonds over the years. And it says Chinese regulators have advised financial institutions to rein in their holdings of U.S. Treasuries. Officials are urging banks to limit purchase of U.S. government bonds and instructed those with high exposure to pare down their positions. but it doesn't apply to China's state holdings of U.S. treasuries. The move was framed around diversifying market risk rather than anything to do with geopolitical maneuvering, supposedly, or fundamental loss of U.S. creditworthiness. But Alexander, I can't imagine that given this massive instability, these conflicts that the U.S. is a part of, that there isn't some role this is playing in this de-dollarization push that we're seeing around the world, especially when it comes to China, where President Xi Jinping and a communist party, supported journal, Chiosha, said he wants the currency of China, the RMB, to be a reserve currency, to be a stronger one, and to be as strong as it can be. What's your assessment of how all of this instability that the Trump administration is creating, whether we're talking about India or Ukraine or Iran, and its impact on this development?
Well, can I just say, first of all, that everything is connected. Even if the regulators, the Chinese regulators, contacted these players in the Chinese financial markets and told them, reduce your holdings of treasuries, and even if they did this for purely economic and financial reasons, there are no such things as purely economic and financial reasons when dealing with a country like the United States. What the United States does politically, geopolitically, in military terms, in foreign policy terms, all of that connects with its underlying financial position. And the risk that countries like China perceive in holding US investments. Inevitably, they do. And given that the United States has been increasingly aggressive in the way that it uses its various financial tools, it's completely unsurprising that the Chinese are becoming very wary, increasingly wary of holding them. And that they're probably saying to themselves, well, look, just a few days ago, Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, openly bragged about how the US created a dollar shortage in Iran and created a crisis there. Well, we're obviously operate in a completely different environment from the one that Iran does. You mustn't compare our economy, China's economy, with Iran. But are we really keen to hold the treasury of a country whose finance minister talks like that? So you see, all of this plays together. But that speech which Xi Jinping gave, which, by the way, I think he actually made back in 2024, January 2024, but which has only been published now, which is interesting in itself and begs many questions. It suggests to me that since that speech, the Chinese have been working very hard on all sorts of things that we probably don't know about in terms of creating financial architecture. Anyway, what Xi Jinping was saying was that we cannot rely on American and Western financial markets, that in order to ensure our future development and growth, we must build up our own and do so based upon Chinese interests and Chinese perspectives as well. And other countries, other BRICS countries are doing the same. The Russians absolutely are doing the same, though obviously they can't do it on the same scale that China can. India is also doing. India chairs the BRICS this year, and the Reserve Bank of India has been very busy promoting ideas over the last few weeks about how the whole new financial architecture that the BRICS are creating can be taken forward. They've been talking about joining up in some form the various digital currencies that all of the various BRIC states, China, Russia, India, are in the process of developing. So all of these countries are looking to create their own financial systems and architecture which interconnect with each other and which are independent of the United States. And this is inevitably going to happen. And Xi Jinping, probably with that speech, which I am sure all of these big players have known about all this time, throughout this 2 years, it seems to me that China is probably taking the lead. Now, just to say this is going to happen, and it's probably going to happen sooner than many people think. I've been reading lots of articles about how difficult it is to replace the dollar and how the US reserve currency position is secure for 10, 20, 30 years because of all sorts of sophisticated technical reasons. I have to say straight away that none of these technical reasons impress me at all. Living in a country, Britain, which once had the world's reserve currency, I can tell you that it can go like this. It doesn't take much time. In fact, in Britain, the pound sterling ceased to be the major reserve currency with one event, which was the devaluation that took place in 1931. And that was when the dollar began to take over. So this assumption that this is an enormously complicated, very difficult thing to do, that these enormous forces of inertia and dollar liquidity somehow will ensure the dollar's position, I think myself that they are completely wrong.
Yeah, it's completely wrong on that level, which is an important level, Alexander. And then, of course, they never predict what the unexpected, what can come unexpectedly, especially for empires in decline and marching toward a collapse, is then major world events, major geopolitical shifts, economic crises that you can't predict, which tend to accelerate things very dramatically. And that's just born throughout history. those events accelerate developments that, of course, you're not going to see if what you are really interested in is just dollar dominance and continuing to wield this dollar to enrich yourself and, of course, to use it as a weapon to do that. Alexander, it was a great conversation today. I really appreciate your time. We can head out together. I want to make sure that everybody knows that your individual channel and the Duran are both in the video description, so you can check those out. Of course, subscribe if you haven't. I want to just thank those who gave super stickers, super chat. Thanks to both of you. And tomorrow I will be back. Look out for the announcement. I believe it'll be Pepe Escobar, 12 noon Eastern time. So tune into this. Hit the like button as you go here. The video description is Alexander's work as well as my own, where you can, and sources where you can support this show. And until next time, everybody, I'll see you tomorrow.